Hi, this is Ruth Bruner. We're going to do part 2 of our interview with Dick Ochsner because he has a lot of stories about the old softball, baseball field that was by the cemetery, and then some more information about Kodak. So here we go.
Years ago, they had a fast pitch team. Severance had one, Windsor had one, Johnstown had one, Fort Collins, and they'd play each other on there. And a lot of the farmers wanted to go in and watch them. So at the start of the season, they'd sell the parking places up closest to the home plate all the way down the line. They'd sell the parking places, and that was a way they raised a little money to maintain the field and stuff. But there was a lot of local people that played softball, and then finally they went to the slow pitch. I played a little bit of fast pitch, but I played probably more slow pitch. And when I kind of got tired of playing there, I decided to be an umpire. So I was an umpire for many years. I went to Winter Park, I went to Vail, different places like that. And one weekend we had a tournament in Greeley, and we got rained out, so we moved that tournament to LaSalle. And we had, this game was about 1 o'clock in the morning. I was doing this game, and a guy by the name of Gene Mingo was the kicker for the Denver Broncos. They had a team up from Denver, and somebody hit a fly ball out to left field. Gene Mingo takes off and runs home. They throw the ball into third base, said they were appealing, he left too soon, and I called him out. Well, here this big black guy looking at me, and I thought that was the end of the world. I didn't know what was going to happen. Luck would have it, over on one of the other fields was a guy by the name of John Masco, who was umpire-in-chief for the state. We had to have him come over and make a decision. They didn't argue with me that he left too soon. They argued that it was an illegal appeal, that it should have went back to the pitcher. The pitcher should have presented the ball and thrown it over there. Well, I said, no, there was never no timeout. They put it directly in there, called it out. That was the end of it. So I was safe doing that. But I umpired and stuff quite a bit over the years.
How old were you when you umpired? How old were you when you umpired?
I was still working at Kodak mostly in my 50s, in through there. So I umpired. We had a team down at Kodak. In fact, there was about 16 teams. Each department practically had a team. And of course, I had summer students that worked for me in the summertime. And some of them were real good athletes. And so they played on our softball team. And we won about 4 or 5 years in a row that we won. And I remember one year, this one kid was in Boulder, and he wasn't able to make it up to work. I sent one of our regular guys in the car, sent him down there to get him to come up and play, because he was a real good ball player. So we had a good team. Sam Ergus's boys, and several other ones, Albert Weber, Marv Brinkman, Jeannie Miller. So we done that. And one year we was in the service. We went to Louisiana on maneuvers. And we went down there, and every night so many would get to go to town. And there was a bunch of us in town. We was drinking a little bit and having a party. And they come in and said, okay, all you guys in the back of this truck, you've partied enough. Well, our second lieutenant happened to be there. Before he got up in the front of the truck, he come to the back and he says, this truck makes 3 stops and 2 turns. I don't want to see one of you guys on the back of here when it gets back to base. So every time it stopped or turned, somebody would jump off. And we often walked cross country till we got back to base. Got back to base the morning of what we was there. Another night there was 6 of us, 3 couples. I had my car, and we wanted to get some moonshine.
Uh-oh.
We heard all about this White Lightning moonshine, so we'd go to a different place, stop, the 3 guys would go up to the door. We'd like to get some moonshine. No, I don't have no moonshine. He couldn't trust 3 guys. Finally, I says, next time we go someplace you stop, I'm going to go up all by myself. So I went up there and I talked to this guy, and I says, I'm from Colorado, and this and that, and I told him different things. I said, I've heard a lot about this moonshine. I wouldn't mind finding somebody that had some. Come over here, he said. I walked over to a little shed, he pulled a board up off the floor, and there it sat. So I bought a quart of moonshine. On the way back to the base, the guys in the back seat opened it up and they spilled a little bit on my seat cover. It ate a hole right in that seat cover. We got back to our apartment, they spilled some on hardwood floors, turned the hardwood floors white. And we drank that stuff.
Ooh.
I was drunk for 2 days.
One and done, huh?
So that was one of our experiences that we had while I was in the service. And then
And you played softball in the service?
played softball in the service.
And then you brought that love back to Windsor, or did you play softball before you went to the service?
Played a little bit before I went. Yeah.
And then umpired after. So then Kodak, I know when they started here in '69, they had one of their health and wellness was to have basketball leagues, softball leagues, other things. So how did that?
That went over real well. They had a good turnout for that. The people, most of them were younger people that they hired, at that time. And they had basketball games, teams, softball teams, and all of that. And people turned out big for all of that stuff.
So what else was it like? Because people may forget that Windsor was almost down to just a couple thousand people when the Great Western Sugar Beet Factory closed before Kodak came.
It was Kodak that brought a lot of the people in here. Because once the factory closed, a lot of these old timers, they just up and retired. They had enough years in and they retired. And of course, the factory was where everybody went. I went there after harvest when I was working at home for Dad. I went and worked in the factory 2 or 3 years that I worked in the factory then the rest of the winter.
So how did they call it the campaign at the factory?
It was when the harvest started. The campaign was the time of the factory actually running, from time it started till it ended.
And it would start in October, September. When did you start harvesting usually?
We started usually the first part of or last part of October for gates.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what was that process like too?
Well, they made, from the byproduct, they made wet beet pulp. And they had a pit down there below that they put the wet beet pulp in. And after it got so full, they put boards in the front to stop it so it wouldn't go out any further. We'd go in there with our trucks in the morning to get wet beet pulp to feed the cattle. And we'd have to stand on a potato screen. It was what they'd use in a sorter. And it had holes, different size holes in it. And they'd shake that back and forth. The potatoes, some would drop through, some would go on to the next one. We'd have to stand on that and load the truck by hand. And then go home and fork it off, shovel it back off into the bunks for the cattle.
And it was the wet stuff.
It was the wet beet pulp.
The wet beet pulp.
Down at Brighton, they had the dried beet pulp. And they put it in great big sacks. It wasn't that they were so heavy, but they was just so hard to handle. And we'd go down there with 2 trucks. My 2 brothers and my dad, we'd go down there with 2 trucks. We'd get 2 loads of dried beet pulp. And down here on GB's farm, he had a barn with a hayloft. We'd open that door under, we'd back the truck in, and 2 of us would throw them up into the barn. The other 2 would drag them over and pile them up. But when we went to feed the stuff, we could back right in underneath there. One guy go up and drag a bag over, open it up, dump it right on the truck. It was real simple to...
Real simple after you hold it how many
after you
times.
hold it that far,
Now, were they like little pellets, the dried beet?
No, it was real small. It was like birdseed or something
Oh,
like that.
that small. Okay. Because we used to get pellets from the Loveland factory
Yeah.
in the 70s. So, all right. So how did you see Kodak evolve and change then over the years?
Well, when I first was there, they was really gone big. They was doing a lot of building and a lot of repairs and bringing different things out from Rochester. And probably the last 10 years that I was there, it started going down. They was letting people go. They weren't hiring back.
Is that the 80s?
And so they kind of, well, like I said earlier, they didn't keep up with the times. They didn't have the digital cameras and the digital phones and all of the digital stuff that we've got today, like a lot of companies did.
So how many buildings were out there?
There was about 10 buildings when I was there. they've since tore down 3 or 4 of them. And at the front of the main front building over to the side, the day that they opened up for business, big shots from Rochester come out. They took pictures of them and everything in front of this big tree that Glenn Bechtel from Highland Nursery planted this big tree. Well, when they had their closing, there was a gal that was more or less the supervisor, the spokesman. So she had everybody there by that tree and was telling everybody how that tree was planted to commemorate Kodak the day they opened. The only thing she didn't know was that wasn't the original tree. The original tree died. Glenn Bechtel brought another one over one night. I met him down there. We took and pulled that one out. He planted the other one. And the second tree is there today. And I would say, I don't think there's anybody else around that knows that that's not the original tree.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Didn't they also have what was called Mahogany Row?
That was upstairs where the big shots.
Yeah, and the wood and offices was made of mahogany. Is that right?
Yeah, their desks, a lot of that.
Yeah. And then when they tore the buildings down, they repurposed that.
Yes. There was one guy, a security guard down there, that stole a truck one night. It was loaded with silver. They used a lot of silver in making a film. And he took off, and they caught him east of Cheyenne, is where they finally caught him with that truck. Now, I don't know where he thought he was going to go to sell that stuff, you know.
Was it in bars? Or how
No, it was
the silver?
big rolls.
In big what?
Rolls.
So what did they use that for?
It meant for the film. Yeah, they used a lot of that for making of the film, like the X-ray film and stuff like that.
All right. Okay, so now we know a little bit more about Kodak and the softball field. So what was your position on the softball field?
Well, I played catcher usually on the slow pitch. Fast pitch, I pitched a little. I wasn't real good. So if I'd get in trouble a lot of times, I'd go out to right field, and that guy would come in and pitch. Maybe he'd only pitch 1 inning. This was when I was in the service and played. He'd pitch like 1 inning or a third of an inning. I'd come back in. He'd go back to right field. And because there's days we'd have 2 and 3 games in one day.
You have to rest a little.
And they had a ruling that you could only pitch so many innings in a 24-hour period. So by him only coming in for 1/3 of an inning, we could keep him. So when we had the final game, the big game, he could pitch it then. He had enough time off that he could do that. So,
well, looks like you've been pitching life pretty well
so
and managing. So I wish you the very,
people,
very best.
people asked me if I was scared when I jumped out of an airplane.
Oh, that's good.
I said, if you weren't scared, you're lying. Shortly before, when the bell would come for us to stand up and get ready, you'd see about half of them doing that. A lot of them bend their heads. When the green light come on, you couldn't stop them if you tried. It was out the door, and that was it. We were going out regardless what it took. I had a second lieutenant that was his first jump with us. He come up and got in front of me. And he was standing in the door, and I looked over at Sarge over to the other side. And, Sarge, what do you want me to do with this guy? Why? I said, well, we had a static line that we had to hook up inside the plane. That automatically pulled your chute out of your pack. He hadn't hooked up. He was standing in the door, ready to jump, and he hadn't hooked up. And Sarge come over and grabbed him, spun him around, and threw him down on the floor. You're not going to do that to me. I'll have your stripes. You don't touch an officer and stuff. Well, he says, we'll talk about it when we get on the ground. I said, I guess we won't talk about it. You won't even make it down there. What do you mean? He says, you're ready to jump out and you hadn't hooked your static line up. Oh, man, did he ever get white. He actually turned out to be a pretty good officer.
Okay.
He'd come, the drop zone would go, and if he was on the front of the plane, you didn't have to walk near far because the assembly point was here. if you got on the back of the plane, you was clear down there, so you had a long ways to walk to get to the assembly point. All he wanted to know is where the assembly point was going to be, if he jumped out first or if he jumped out last. And he become a pretty decent officer after that.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you've had important people in your life, and I think you've made a big difference
it has.
in a lot of people's lives too,
It
Dick.
has, yeah.
Well, thank you
Like
very
I said
much.
earlier, I'm so blessed to have the family that I've got, to have my health at this age, and everything that way. I can't thank the good Lord enough.
All right. Thank you for your time.